The blood-curdling howls pierced the twilight air as Haven Keller gripped her father's old Colt revolver tighter, her knuckles white against the worn handle. 3 massive timber wolves circled her position by the fallen oak, their yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intent in the fading Arizona light of 1885. She had never imagined her journey to her uncle's ranch outside Eager would end like this, backed against a tree, her horse having bolted after throwing her, and a pack of hungry wolves deciding she might make a suitable dinner. Back. Haven shouted, firing a warning shot into the ground near the largest wolf, a scarred beast with a gray muzzle. The animal flinched but didn't retreat, growing bolder as its companions closed in from the sides. She counted her remaining bullets 4, not enough if they all decided to lunge at once. The nearest settlement was at least 5 miles away, and night was falling rapidly over the rugged landscape. Haven's long auburn hair whipped across her face as she pivoted to track the wolves' movements, her burgundy traveling dress torn at the hem from her fall. "I am not dying in the middle of nowhere," she muttered through gritted teeth, steadying her aim at the lead wolf who had advanced another step. The crack of a rifle shot split the air, and one of the wolves yelped in pain, breaking away from the circle. The remaining 2 wolves turned toward the sound, hackles raised. "Don't move, madam," called a deep voice from the ridge above. A second shot rang out, sending another wolf scampering into the brush with a panicked howl. The leader stood its ground a moment longer, snarling toward the newcomer before reluctantly retreating, disappearing into the gathering darkness with its wounded companions. Haven kept her revolver raised, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she scanned the ridgeline. A tall figure on horseback emerged, rifle still at the ready as he surveyed the area to ensure the wolves were truly gone. "They'll be back with more before long," the man called, guiding his chestnut stallion down the slope with practiced ease. "We need to get moving." As he approached, Haven took in the sight of him, broad-shouldered and trail-worn, with a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but couldn't disguise his strong jawline. Dust coated his denim and leather attire, speaking to long days in the saddle. "Xavier Stillman," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly. His eyes, a startling shade of blue against his sun-darkened skin, assessed her with equal parts concern and curiosity. "You're a fair shot, but you'd have needed more than that little 6-shooter against a hungry pack." Haven lowered her weapon but didn't holster it. "Haven Keller, I appreciate the assistance, Mr. Stillman, but I'm quite capable of handling myself." The hint of a smile crossed Xavier's face. "I don't doubt that, Miss Keller, but even the most capable folks need help against wolves." He glanced at the darkening sky. "My cabin's about 3 miles from here. You're welcome to shelter there until morning." Haven hesitated, weighing her options. She knew better than to trust strangers in the territory, but the howls echoing in the distance made her decision easier. "My horse bolted after I was thrown. I'm headed to my uncle's ranch near Eager." "Morgan Keller's place?" Xavier asked, surprise evident in his voice. Haven nodded, suspicious. "You know my uncle? Everyone within 50 miles knows Morgan. Good man." Xavier extended his hand down to her. "I can take you there tomorrow. For now, we should get to safety before that pack returns with reinforcements." Haven reluctantly took his offered hand, allowing herself to be pulled up behind him on the horse. "Thank you, Mr. Stillman. Most folks just call me X," he said, nudging his horse forward. "Hold tight. Artemis here moves fast when she needs to." Haven placed her hands cautiously at his sides, noticing the pistol holstered at his hip and the tension in his posture as he scanned their surroundings continuously. The howls seemed closer now, causing Artemis to snort nervously. "They're tracking us," Xavier said quietly, spurring his horse to a gallop. "Been a hard winter, makes them desperate." Haven tightened her grip as they raced across the rugged terrain, the wind whipping her hair wildly. She couldn't help but notice how naturally Xavier moved with his horse, as though they were one entity navigating the challenging landscape with practiced ease. "You're not from around here," Xavier observed after they'd put some distance between themselves and the wolves' cries. "Scent." Louis, Haven replied, the words jostled by the horse's movement. My parents passed last fall, influenza. Xavier offered a solemn nod. Sorry to hear that, lost my own to the same about 6 years back. The simple acknowledgement of shared grief felt strangely comforting as they rode in silence for a while, the only sounds being Artemis's hoofbeats and the occasional distant howl. A small cabin came into view as they crested a hill, nestled against a backdrop of ponderosa pines. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a corral stood adjacent with 3 horses grazing peacefully. Home sweet home, Xavier announced, slowing Artemis to a walk as they approached. It's not much, but it's secure. The cabin was sturdy but modest, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw, a covered porch spanning the front with a rocking chair and various tools hanging from pegs. A large dog, part shepherd and something else entirely, bounded from the side of the house, barking excitedly. That's Scout, Xavier said, dismounting and offering Haven a hand down. He's friendly, just loud, keeps the predators away most nights. Haven approached the dog cautiously, allowing him to sniff her hand before scratching behind his ears. He's beautiful. Xavier smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, transforming his weather-worn face momentarily. He thinks so too. He led Artemis to the corral, speaking softly to the horse as he removed the saddle. I'll get a fire going stronger inside. There should be some stew left from this morning. Haven followed him into the cabin after he'd secured Artemis, finding the interior surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's dwelling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a table and chairs made from rough pine positioned nearby. A curtained-off section presumably hid his sleeping quarters, while shelves lined with books, preserved foods, and various supplies covered another wall. Rifles and hunting equipment hung from carefully positioned hooks. Please sit, Xavier gestured to the table while stoking the fire. Been a while since I've had company that wasn't passing through on business. Haven sat, removing her gloves and rubbing her cold hands together. What business brings people this far out? Xavier tended to the pot hanging over the fire, his back to her. I guide hunting parties sometimes. Track lost cattle for the ranchers. Occasionally help the sheriff track those who don't want to be found. A bounty hunter? Haven asked, tension returning to her posture. Xavier turned, noticing her unease. Not anymore, just someone who knows the land better than most. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, placing one before her with a chunk of slightly stale bread. Eat, you've had a long day. The stew was surprisingly flavorful venison with wild onions, potatoes, and herbs she couldn't identify. Haven hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. This is delicious, she admitted between bites. Xavier settled across from her with his own bowl. My mother taught me, said no son of hers would live on beans and bacon alone. His eyes crinkled at the memory. She sounds wise, Haven said, noticing for the first time a fiddle hanging on the wall. Do you play? Xavier followed her gaze. On occasion, when the silence gets too loud. He studied her with that same careful assessment from earlier. What brings a city lady from St. Louis all the way to Eager? Most folks are heading the other direction. Haven set down her spoon, considering how much to share with this stranger who had saved her life. My uncle is all the family I have left. He's offered me a place to stay and work on his ranch. She hesitated. And I needed to leave St. Louis behind. Too many memories. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. Fresh starts are worth their weight in gold out here. Territory's hard, but it's fair in its way. A howl, closer than before, interrupted their conversation. Scout growled from his position by the door, and Xavier rose to check the window. They've followed our trail, he said grimly, reaching for one of the rifles. But they won't get past Scout and the cabin walls. Try to get some rest, Miss Keller. I'll take the chair. Haven started to protest, but exhaustion was overtaking her. The emotional and physical toll of the day, from being thrown from her horse to facing down wolves to this strange rescue, had drained her completely. Thank you, Mr. Stillman, she said, rising from the table, for everything today. Xavier nodded, his expression softening slightly. He reminded her, and you're welcome. There's water in the pitcher by the bed if you need it. Haven made her way to the curtained area, finding a neatly made bed with worn but clean quilts. As she settled in, she could hear Xavier moving about the cabin, checking windows and doors, speaking softly to Scout. Despite the howling wolves outside, Haven felt safer than she had in months. The dawn light filtered through the small window, rousing Haven from the deepest sleep she'd had since leaving St. Louis. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind, the unfamiliar scent of pine and wood smoke, the rough texture of handmade quilts against her skin, the sounds of movement beyond the curtains separating her from the main room. Reality rushed back as she remembered the previous day's events. Sitting up, she smoothed her rumpled traveling dress as best she could and attempted to tame her hair into some semblance of order. "Coffee's hot if you want some," Xavier's voice called from the other side of the curtain. "And there's fresh biscuits." Haven stepped out to find him at the table, cleaning a rifle with methodical precision. Scout lay at his feet, tail thumping against the floor in greeting. The cabin was warmer than the night before, the fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth. "Good morning," she said, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance after a night in her clothes. Xavier glanced up briefly, then returned to his task. "Morning, sleep well, better than expected," Haven admitted, pouring herself a cup of the strong-smelling coffee. The wolves moved on before midnight, probably found easier prey. He set the rifle aside and reached for his own cup. "We should head to your uncle's place soon, storms moving in from the north." Haven joined him at the table, accepting a biscuit still warm from the fire. "You can tell that just by looking at the sky," a hint of amusement crossed Xavier's face. "Been living out here long enough, you start to read the signs." He nodded toward the window where dark clouds were building on the horizon. "That kind brings snow, late for April but not unheard of." Haven bit into the biscuit, surprisingly light and flavorful. "These are excellent." "Another of my mother's lessons," Xavier said, rising to check something on the fire. "Said a man relying on others for bread is only half free." Haven studied him as he moved around the cabin with efficient purpose, gathering supplies into a saddlebag. Despite his rough exterior, there was something gentle in the way he handled his possessions, spoke to his dog, even the measured tone of his voice. "How far is my uncle's ranch?" she asked, finishing her coffee. "About 4 hours' ride if the weather holds." Xavier handed her a worn but clean coat. "You'll need this. Your dress won't keep the cold out if that snow starts falling." Haven accepted the coat, which smelled of pine and horse and something uniquely him. "Thank you, I can return it when we arrive." Xavier shook his head. "Keep it, got others." He hesitated, then added, "Your uncle knows you were coming." "I sent a letter from Santa Fe," Haven explained. "But I'm several days later than expected. The stage had mechanical troubles in Albuquerque." Xavier nodded, shouldering his rifle and saddlebag. "Morgan's place is good, well run, you'll be safe there." Something in his tone suggested a history with her uncle's ranch, but Haven didn't press. They set out within the hour, Haven once again riding behind Xavier on Artemis. Scout followed alongside, occasionally darting into the brush after scents only he could detect. The sky continued to darken as they rode, and the temperature dropped noticeably. "Your uncle's been in these parts since before the war," Xavier said after they'd been riding in comfortable silence for some time. "Started with nothing but a few head of cattle and that piece of land nobody wanted. He wrote to my father about his successes," Haven replied. "But they weren't close. Father disapproved when Uncle Morgan came west instead of joining the family business." Xavier guided Artemis around a rocky outcropping. "What business was that?" "Banking," Haven said, the word feeling strange on her lips out here in the wild. "Very respectable." "Very proper." Xavier made a non-committal sound that might have been amusement. "Not much use for bankers out here. Men like your uncle, though they built something from nothing, that earns respect." "Is that what you're doing?" Haven asked. "Building something from nothing?" Xavier was quiet so long that Haven thought he might not answer. "Just living each day," he finally said. "That's enough for now." The first snowflakes began to fall as they crossed a shallow stream, fat white flakes that melted instantly upon contact with the ground. "We should pick up the pace," Xavier said. urging Artemis into a faster trot. This will get worse before it gets better. Haven tightened her grip around his waist as they increased speed, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him against the increasingly cold air. The snow began falling more heavily, reducing visibility and coating the landscape in a rapidly thickening white blanket. They were passing through a narrow canyon when Scout suddenly stopped, hackles raised as he growled toward a ridge above them. Xavier reined Artemis to a halt, one hand moving instinctively toward his pistol. "What is it?" Haven whispered, scanning the snow-blurred outlines of the rocks above. "Not sure," Xavier murmured, his body tense with alertness. "Could be nothing." Could be the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked echoed from above, followed by a voice calling out in the swirling snow. "That's far enough, Stillman." Xavier slowly raised his hands away from his weapons. "We're just passing through, Harker, heading to Morgan Keller's place." A harsh laugh answered him. "Convenient. We were just talking about paying old Morgan a visit ourselves." Three men emerged from behind the rocks above them, rifles trained on Xavier and Haven. Their clothes were dirty and worn, their faces partially obscured by scarves against the cold. "This doesn't need to get messy," the apparent leader said, making his way down toward them. "Just hand over whatever valuables you're carrying and we'll be on our way." Xavier remained still, his voice steady. "You know I don't carry much worth taking, Harker, and the lady's just passing through." The man named Harker approached cautiously, keeping his rifle aimed at Xavier's chest. "Times are hard, Stillman, and word is you've been doing some tracking for the sheriff lately." He spat on the ground. "Turning on your own kind." "Never was your kind, Harker," Xavier replied coldly. "Now back off before this gets unpleasant." Haven felt her heart pounding as the standoff continued, the snow swirling around them in increasingly thick curtains. Scout growled continuously, circling behind the nearest outlaw with predatory focus. "The way I see it," Harker said, "we've got the advantage here. 3 guns to your 1. 2, Haven said suddenly, drawing her revolver from beneath Xavier's coat where she'd kept it hidden. "And I rarely miss at this range." Harker's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected development, but he recovered quickly with a smirk. Well, got yourself a wildcat there, Stillman." "Last chance, Harker," Xavier said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Walk away." The tense moment stretched, broken only by the howling wind and Scout's continued growling. Finally, Harker lowered his rifle slightly. "Another day, perhaps," he said, backing away slowly. "Give my regards to Morgan." His eyes narrowed as he looked at Haven. "And welcome to Arizona territory, miss. Hope you're better at choosing friends than Stillman here." The 3 men retreated up the canyon, disappearing into the thickening snowfall. Xavier remained tense until they were well out of sight, then turned to Haven with newfound respect in his eyes. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. Haven holstered her revolver, trying to stop her hands from shaking. "Perhaps a bit of both. Who were they?" Xavier urged Artemis forward, increasing their pace. "Harker and his boys fancy themselves outlaws. Small-time thieves mostly, but dangerous enough when cornered. We need to reach your uncle's place before they decide to circle back." They rode hard through the worsening storm, the snow now thick enough to muffle the sound of Artemis's hooves. Scout stayed close, occasionally ranging ahead to check their path. Haven found herself clinging tighter to Xavier as the cold intensified, grateful for his solid presence and the warmth that radiated through his coat. "Not much farther," Xavier called over his shoulder as they crested a rise, revealing a valley below partially obscured by snow. "Morgan's place is just beyond that stand of trees." Haven peered through the white curtain, making out the faint outlines of buildings and corrals in the distance. Relief flooded through her at the sight of civilization after her harrowing introduction to the territory. They approached the ranch from the north, passing through a gate marked with a stylized K worked into the ironwork. Several buildings formed a rough square around a central yard, a large main house built of sturdy logs and stone, a bunkhouse, barns, and various outbuildings. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, promising warmth within. As they rode into the yard, men emerged from the barn, hands moving toward weapons until they recognized Xavier. Stillman, called a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shock of white hair. "What brings you here in this weather?" Xavier dismounted, offering Haven a hand down. "Special delivery, Morgan. Found your niece fighting off wolves about 15 miles north of here yesterday evening." Morgan Keller's weathered face broke into a smile of relief as he rushed forward. "Haven, thank God, we've been worried sick since you didn't arrive when expected." He embraced her tightly, then held her at arm's length to examine her. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Uncle Morgan," Haven assured him, suddenly overwhelmed by the emotions of the past 24 hours. "Mr. Stillman saved my life," Morgan turned to Xavier with genuine gratitude. "Then I'm deeply in your debt," he clapped Xavier on the shoulder. "Come inside, both of you. This storm's not letting up anytime soon." The interior of the main house was warm and welcoming, far more refined than Haven had expected. Quality furniture, woven rugs, and oil paintings suggested that her uncle had indeed prospered in the years since leaving St. Louis. "Martha," Morgan called. "Look who's finally arrived." A plump, pleasant-faced woman hurried from what appeared to be the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up at the sight of Haven. "Oh, my dear girl, we've been so worried." She embraced Haven warmly. "You're frozen through. Come sit by the fire while I make some tea." Haven found herself ushered to a comfortable chair near the hearth, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders despite her protests that she was fine. Scout had been welcomed into the kitchen with promises of scraps from Martha, while Xavier and Morgan stood talking quietly near the door. "Harker and his boys," Xavier was saying in a low voice. "Might be nothing, but the way he mentioned your place specifically concerns me." Morgan nodded gravely. "I've heard they've been getting bolder lately. I'll have the men keep extra watch tonight." He glanced toward Haven. "Thank you for bringing her safely, if anything had happened." "She's quite capable," Xavier replied, a hint of admiration in his tone that sent an unexpected warmth through Haven. Stood her ground against both wolves and Harker with remarkable composure. Martha returned with tea and a plate of cookies, interrupting Haven's eavesdropping. "Drink this, dear. It'll warm you from the inside out." She patted Haven's hand. "Your room is all prepared upstairs, been ready for weeks, but we're just glad you've arrived safely." Haven accepted the tea gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Just Martha, dear. I've been keeping house for your uncle for nearly 15 years now." Her kind eyes twinkled, "and trying to civilize him for just as long with limited success." Morgan approached, Xavier following a step behind. "Martha's being modest. She runs this place better than I ever could." He sat in the chair opposite Haven. "Your father never mentioned in his letters that you were so grown up. Last he wrote, you were still in finishing school." "That was nearly 6 years ago," Haven said softly. "Father wasn't much for correspondence after Mother became ill." Morgan's face softened with grief. "I wish I could have been there. Edward and I had our differences, but he was still my brother." An awkward silence fell, broken by Xavier clearing his throat. "I should get going before the storm worsens." "Nonsense," Morgan insisted. "No one's traveling in this. The north guest room is yours for the night, and that's final." Xavier hesitated, his eyes briefly meeting Haven's before he nodded. "Appreciate it, Morgan." Martha bustled off to prepare another room, and Morgan excused himself to check on the livestock, leaving Haven and Xavier alone by the fire. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable despite their brief acquaintance. "Your uncle is well respected in these parts," Xavier finally said, settling into the chair Morgan had vacated. "Built all this from nothing but hard work and fair dealing." Haven studied him over the rim of her teacup. "You seem to know him well." A shadow crossed Xavier's face. "He gave me work when others wouldn't, after." He trailed off, then simply said, "After I returned from the war." Haven nodded, understanding that some memories were too painful to share with a near stranger. "The war between the states, Union cavalry," Xavier confirmed. "Came west afterward like many did, looking for something different. And did you find it?" Haven asked. Xavier's blue eyes reflected the dancing flames. "Parts of it, still looking for the rest." He stood abruptly, as if uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. You should rest. Been quite an ordeal for your first days in the territory. Haven found herself strangely reluctant to end their conversation. Thank you again, Mr. Stillman, for everything. He reminded her with the ghost of a smile, then departed to find Morgan, leaving Haven with her thoughts and the crackling fire. The snowstorm lasted through the night and into the following day, transforming the ranch into a winter wonderland despite the spring season. Haven spent the time becoming acquainted with her new home, the sprawling main house with its surprising luxuries, the well-ordered operations of the ranch, and most importantly, the people who made it function. Morgan Keller proved to be nothing like the wild frontiersman her father had described. Though certainly rugged and plain-spoken, he was also educated, thoughtful, and possessed a dry wit that reminded Haven painfully of her father. Martha, while not officially her aunt, quickly assumed a maternal role that Haven hadn't realized she'd been missing since her mother's death. Xavier remained at the ranch through the storm, helping Morgan's men secure buildings against the unexpected weather, and keeping watch for any sign of Harker's gang. Haven found herself watching him when he wasn't aware the careful precision with which he moved, the quiet authority he commanded without effort, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. On the evening of the second day, the snow finally stopped. The ranch hands celebrated by organizing an impromptu gathering in the main house, with food, drink, and music flowing freely. Several of the men produced instruments, a fiddle, harmonica, and even a banjo, filling the large sitting room with lively tunes. Haven, dressed in one of the new dresses Martha had thoughtfully prepared for her arrival, found herself enjoying the simple celebration more than any St. Louis society function she'd ever attended. The genuine warmth and camaraderie among the ranch workers was infectious, and she found herself laughing more than she had in years. "Your uncle throws quite the party," Xavier commented, appearing beside her with 2 cups of cider. He'd cleaned up considerably since their arrival, his beard trimmed and his hair neatly combed, wearing a fresh shirt that Morgan had loaned him. Haven accepted the cider with a smile. "It seems to be Martha's doing, actually. Uncle says she believes in rewarding hard work with proper celebration." "Wise woman," Xavier agreed, his eyes tracking Scout, who was making the rounds of the gathering, collecting affection and scraps with equal enthusiasm. One of the ranch hands called for Xavier to join them with the fiddle they'd spotted him carrying from his horse earlier. He shook his head in polite refusal until Morgan himself insisted, placing the instrument in Xavier's hands with a challenge Haven couldn't quite hear. With reluctant grace, Xavier took position near the hearth, testing the strings with practiced fingers before tucking the fiddle under his chin. The room quieted in anticipation as he drew the bow across the strings, producing a sweet, mournful note that seemed to hang in the air. The melody that followed captured Haven completely, a haunting tune that spoke of longing and wide open spaces, of solitude and beauty found in unexpected places. Xavier played with his eyes closed, his normally guarded expression open and vulnerable as the music flowed through him. When the last note faded, the room remained silent for a heartbeat before erupting in appreciative applause. Xavier opened his eyes, looking momentarily startled to find himself the center of attention. His gaze sought Haven's across the room, and the connection between them felt almost tangible. "Didn't know the man could play like that," murmured one of the younger ranch hands nearby. "Always figured him for the silent, dangerous type." "He's both," responded an older worker with a knowing nod. "Saw him track a mountain lion that had been taking calves last spring, 3 days through the worst country imaginable, never complained once. Found the cat and took it down with a single shot at 300 yards. Haven listened with growing curiosity as Xavier relinquished the fiddle to another player and made his way back toward her through the crowd of well-wishers. "That was beautiful," she said when he reached her side. "Where did you learn to play like that?" A hint of color touched Xavier's cheeks. "My grandfather taught me, said music was food for a man's soul when everything else ran scarce." "He was right," Haven replied softly. The celebration continued around them, but they remained in their own quiet bubble of conversation, discovering shared interests in books and surprising connections in their vastly different upbringings. Xavier spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his brief time at university before the war called him away, and his eventual journey west seeking peace he hadn't found in the aftermath of the conflict. Haven found herself sharing more than she'd intended her restricted upbringing in sent. Louis society, her father's plans for her to marry a business associate's son before illness swept through their household, her secret relief at escaping the suffocating future that had been planned for her. So coming west was more than just necessity, Xavier observed astutely. Haven nodded, surprised by his perception. Yes, though I wouldn't have chosen quite such a dramatic introduction to frontier life. Xavier's rare smile appeared. Few get to choose their beginnings here. It's what comes after that defines us. The gathering began to wind down as the hour grew late. Ranch hands drifted off to the bunkhouse, and Martha shooed the remaining guests toward the door with good-natured efficiency. Morgan had already retired to his study with several of his foremen to discuss the next day's work. Haven found herself on the front porch with Xavier, watching the moonlight reflect off the snow-covered landscape. The air was bitingly cold but crystal clear, the stars impossibly bright against the black velvet sky. "I've never seen stars like this," Haven admitted, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "In St. Louis, the city lights and coal smoke hide most of them." "That's one thing the territory has in abundance," Xavier replied, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Clear skies and room to breathe." A comfortable silence fell between them as they gazed upward. Haven was acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid, reassuring, yet still mysterious in many ways. "I'll be heading out at first light," Xavier said finally. "Storms passed and I've business in Eager." Haven felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course, you've already delayed your plans considerably on my account." Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "It was no hardship, Miss Keller." "Haven," she corrected gently. "After wolves, outlaws, and snowstorms, I think we've moved beyond formalities." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Haven," he agreed, her name sounding different in his deep voice. For a moment she thought he might say more, but instead he simply nodded and stepped back. "Good night, then, and good luck with your new beginning." Haven watched him walk toward the guest quarters, Scout trotting faithfully at his heels, and wondered why his departure felt like a loss when she had known him for such a short time. The following weeks brought Haven a crash course in ranch life as she settled into her role at the Keller homestead. Morgan proved to be a patient teacher, showing her the operation of the ranch from cattle management to business ledgers. Haven discovered she had a knack for the latter, gradually taking over more of the account books as she learned the rhythms of the business. Martha took Haven under her wing, teaching her the practical skills her finishing school education had neglected: cooking over a wood stove, preserving fruits and vegetables for the winter months, and even basic medical care for both humans and animals. Though physically demanding, Haven found the work deeply satisfying in ways her previous life had never been. Each day brought tangible accomplishments, from successfully baking her first batch of bread without burning it to helping deliver a foal in the pre-dawn hours. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned despite her bonnets, and her city mannerisms gradually gave way to the more direct approach favored in the territory. Xavier Stillman remained on the periphery of her thoughts, though she heard his name mentioned occasionally among the ranch hands or visitors to the property. According to local gossip, he'd been hired by the territorial marshal to track a gang that had robbed the stage to Prescott. He'd been successful, the outlaws were in custody, and he'd reportedly moved on to another job farther north. Spring progressed into early summer, bringing with it longer days and the intense work of the cattle roundup. Haven found herself in the thick of activity, helping Martha provide meals for the increased workforce and assisting her uncle with the considerable paperwork involved in selling and shipping cattle to markets in California and Colorado. It was during this busy season, nearly 6 weeks after her arrival, that Haven encountered Xavier again. She was returning from Eager with supplies when she spotted a familiar figure on horseback approaching the ranch from the east. Scout noticed her first, barking enthusiastically and racing ahead to greet her. "Well, hello there," Haven laughed, dismounting to scratch the dog's ears. "I've missed you too." Xavier approached at a more measured pace, the ghost of a smile visible beneath his now fuller beard. "He's been insufferable since we picked up your scent about a mile back," he said by way of greeting. Apparently, fighting wolves together creates a lasting bond. Haven felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at seeing him again. He looked leaner than before, his skin darkened further by the summer sun, a new scar visible along his jawline. "Uncle Morgan mentioned you were working with the marshal," she said, remounting her horse to ride alongside him toward the ranch. "Successful from what we heard." Xavier nodded, adjusting his hat against the bright sunlight. "Mostly. The territory's getting more settled but still draws those looking to avoid the law." He glanced at her appraisingly. "Ranch life seems to agree with you." Haven smiled, realizing she felt more herself than she ever had in St. Louis. "It does, surprisingly, though I still have much to learn." "Morgan says you've taken to the books like you were born to it," Xavier commented. "Says you found discrepancies in his cattle sales that he'd missed for years." Haven felt a flush of pride at her uncle's praise. "It's just a matter of attention to detail. The same principles apply whether it's banking or beef." They rode in comfortable silence for a moment before Xavier spoke again. "I brought news Morgan should hear. Mind if I accompany you back?" Haven noticed the tension in his voice. "Is it about Harker?" Xavier's expression darkened. "Among other things, the gang he's running with has gotten bolder. 2 ranches hit in the past month, one about 40 miles from here." Concern clouded Haven's thoughts as they continued toward the ranch. Morgan had mentioned increased activity from rustlers and outlaws in the region, but had assured her the Keller ranch was too well established and protected to be a likely target. They found Morgan in the main corral, evaluating a string of new horses with his foreman. His face brightened at the sight of Xavier, though concern quickly replaced his smile when he noted the serious expression on the younger man's face. "Stillman," he greeted, extending a hand, "guessing this isn't just a social call." Xavier dismounted, clasping Morgan's hand firmly. "Afraid not." "Got word from Sheriff Taylor in Springerville about Harker's latest activities. Thought you should know." Morgan nodded grimly. "Let's take this inside." He turned to his foreman. "Jim, make sure we double the night watch for the next while." In Morgan's study, Xavier laid out what he knew Harker had joined forces with a more dangerous outfit led by a man named Carson, who had a reputation for violence that extended as far as Texas. They were systematically targeting ranches in the region, stealing cattle and horses and leaving destruction in their wake. "Taylor thinks they're building toward something bigger," Xavier explained, accepting the whiskey Morgan offered. "The Simmons place they hit last week was just a test run." Morgan paced by the window, his expression troubled. "What's your assessment? Are we a likely target?" Xavier took a measured sip before answering. "You're the biggest operation within 100 miles, more cattle, more horses, more potential profit." His eyes met Morgan's directly. "And Harker mentioned you specifically that day in the canyon. There's history there I don't know about." Morgan sighed heavily, settling into his chair. "Harker worked for me about 5 years back, caught him stealing and fired him. He didn't take it well, made some threats. Didn't think he had the backbone to follow through." Haven, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, spoke up. "What can we do?" Both men turned, seemingly having forgotten her presence. Morgan gestured for her to join them. "We increase security, alert the neighboring ranches, and prepare for trouble," Morgan said with the pragmatism that had built his successful operation. "And we could use someone with Xavier's tracking skills if you're available." Xavier studied his glass thoughtfully. "I've got no other commitments at the moment. Sheriff Taylor already asked if I'd help coordinate between the ranches." He glanced at Haven. "It might get dangerous." "I'm not afraid," Haven replied with more confidence than she entirely felt. "This is my home now, too." Something flickered in Xavier's eyes at her words' approval, perhaps, or something deeper that she couldn't quite name. Then it's settled, Morgan declared, refilling their glasses. Xavier will stay on for a while, help us prepare. He raised his glass in a toast, to facing trouble head-on. They clinked glasses, the moment solemn despite the casual gesture. Haven felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation, fear of the danger Xavier had described, but anticipation at the prospect of working alongside him in the days to come. Xavier integrated seamlessly into the ranch's operations over the next few weeks, dividing his time between training the ranch hands in defensive techniques, scouting the property's boundaries for signs of intruders, and coordinating with neighboring ranches to establish a warning system if trouble appeared. Haven found herself working closely with him as they mapped the ranch's most vulnerable points and cataloged its resources. She was impressed by his methodical approach and encyclopedic knowledge of the territory, while he seemed equally appreciative of her organizational skills and quick grasp of tactical considerations. "You'd have made a fine officer," he commented one evening as they reviewed their preparations in Morgan's study. "Better than most I served under." Haven looked up from the map she'd been annotating with potential lookout positions. "I doubt the Union Army would have been progressive enough to accept my application," she replied with a wry smile. Xavier's laugh was unexpected and warm, transforming his usually serious face. "True enough, their loss." These quiet moments of camaraderie became increasingly frequent as they worked together, building a partnership that went beyond their initial rescue scenario. Haven discovered that beneath Xavier's taciturn exterior was a thoughtful, well-read man with strong principles and unexpected depths. He, in turn, seemed to appreciate her direct approach and refusal to be sheltered from the harsher realities of their situation. Summer reached its peak, bringing scorching days and the constant threat of drought. The ranch hands worked tirelessly to move cattle to water sources and prevent grass fires, while Haven and Martha ensured everyone remained fed and hydrated during the punishing heat. Xavier continued his regular scouting missions, often disappearing for days at a time to check on neighboring ranches or follow up on rumors of Harker's gang. Each time he returned, Haven found herself watching for his approach, relief washing over her when his familiar silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was during one such return, nearly a month into their preparations, that everything changed. Xavier rode in at dusk, his expression grim and his horse showing signs of hard riding. "They hit the Thompson place last night," he announced without preamble as Morgan and Haven met him in the yard. "Burned the barn, ran off half their stock. Thompson's son was shot when he tried to stop them." "Is he alive?" Morgan asked sharply. Xavier dismounted wearily. "Yes, but badly wounded. Doc Ellis is with him." He patted Artemis's neck apologetically. "They're moving in this direction, 3, maybe 4 days out by my estimation." Morgan turned to his foreman, who had joined them upon hearing the commotion. "Jim, gather everyone in the main house in 30 minutes. We need to finalize our plans." As the ranch erupted into controlled activity, Haven approached Xavier, noting the exhaustion evident in his posture and the tightness around his eyes. "When did you last sleep?" he shrugged dismissively. "I'm fine." "That wasn't my question," Haven persisted, taking Artemis's reins from him. "Go inside. I'll see to your horse and bring you something to eat." Xavier looked as if he might argue, but instead gave her a tired nod. "Thank you." When Haven entered the kitchen 20 minutes later, having personally ensured Artemis was properly cared for, she found Xavier seated at the table with a cup of coffee in his hands, Scout dozing at his feet. He had washed the worst of the trail dust from his face and hands, but fatigue was etched into every line of his body. "Martha's preparing food for everyone," Haven explained, setting a plate of bread and cold meat before him. "Eat something before the meeting." Xavier complied without protest, further evidence of his exhaustion. "Thompson wasn't prepared," he said between bites, "despite all our warnings." Haven sat across from him, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "And we are better," Xavier admitted. But they outnumber us and they're not afraid to use violence. He met her gaze directly. I want you to consider leaving until this is over. Morgan has friends in Prescott who would— No, Haven interrupted firmly. I won't abandon my home or my family. Xavier studied her with an intensity that might have made her uncomfortable weeks earlier. Now she met his gaze steadily, unwavering in her resolve. I expected that answer, he finally said, a hint of respect coloring his tone, but I had to ask. I appreciate your concern, Haven replied more gently, but my place is here. The sound of boots in the hallway announced the arrival of others for the meeting. Xavier rose, hesitating before speaking again. Stay close to the house when it happens. You're a good shot, but— I'll be careful, Haven promised, touched by his concern. The meeting that followed was somber and focused. Xavier detailed what he'd learned about Harker and Carson's tactics, while Morgan outlined their defensive strategy. Every able-bodied person on the ranch was assigned responsibilities, from the youngest stable boy to Martha herself, who announced matter-of-factly that she still remembered how to load and fire the shotgun her late husband had taught her to use. Haven was tasked with organizing the household preparations, securing essential supplies, preparing the cellar as both storage area and potential refuge, and establishing a rudimentary medical station with Martha's guidance. Though part of her wished for a more active role in the coming confrontation, she recognized the importance of her assignment. As the meeting dispersed, people moving with renewed purpose toward their tasks, Xavier pulled Haven aside in the hallway. His face was troubled in the lamplight, shadows accentuating the angles of his features. There's something I need to say, he began, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. If things go badly, they won't, Haven interjected, suddenly afraid of what might follow. Xavier shook his head. Listen, please. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. These past weeks working with you, they've meant more than I expected, more than I had any right to hope for. Haven felt her heart quicken at his words, at the vulnerability so rarely displayed on his weathered face. Xavier, she started, but he gently placed a finger against her lips. Let me finish before my courage fails, he said softly. I've been alone a long time, thought that was my lot after the war, after everything I'd seen and done. Then you appeared, fighting wolves with nothing but a six-shooter and sheer determination. A small smile touched his lips at the memory. And something changed. I changed. Haven remained silent, scarcely breathing as he continued. I don't have much to offer. No fine house or family name worth mentioning. Just myself, flawed as I am. His hand moved to gently touch her cheek. But whatever happens in the days ahead, I wanted you to know that you've awakened something in me I thought was long dead. Before Haven could respond, the front door opened as Morgan returned from seeing off some of the ranch hands, breaking the intimate moment. Xavier stepped back, his expression closing once more into its familiar, careful neutrality. Dawn patrol leaves in 5 hours, Morgan announced, either oblivious to or diplomatically ignoring the charged atmosphere between them. Stillman, you should get some rest while you can, Xavier nodded, his eyes lingering on Haven's face for a moment longer before he turned away. Good night, he said simply, though the words seemed to carry the weight of all he'd just confessed. Haven watched him go, her thoughts in turmoil, wondering if she would have the chance to tell him that her feelings echoed his own, that somehow, in the midst of danger and preparation, she had found herself falling in love with this quiet, honorable man who had saved her life and then, unexpectedly, captured her heart. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity as the ranch transformed into a virtual fortress. Cattle were moved to the most defensible pastures, horses brought in closer to the main buildings, and lookout posts established on key approaches. Ranch hands moved about with rifles close at hand, and even the daily routines of cooking and cleaning took on a heightened sense of purpose. Haven threw herself into her preparations, working from dawn until well past dusk to ensure everything was ready. The physical labor helped distract her from the constant worry and from the unresolved conversation with Xavier, who had been equally busy coordinating the ranch's defenses with Morgan and Jim. They interacted frequently, but always in the presence of others, their exchanges limited to practical matters of security and supplies. Yet Haven was acutely aware of a new undercurrent between them, glances held a moment longer than necessary, incidental touches that sent warmth coursing through her despite the tense circumstances. On the afternoon of the third day, one of the outriders galloped in with news, a dust cloud to the northeast, moving slowly but steadily toward the ranch. Morgan ordered the prearranged signal, fired 3 shots in rapid succession, calling everyone back to their defensive positions. Controlled chaos ensued as the final preparations were made. Women and children were secured in the main house, with Martha organizing them into teams responsible for loading weapons, tending to potential injuries, and monitoring the windows for any attempt to breach the building. Haven found Xavier in the barn, checking weapons with Morgan and several of the senior hands. He looked up at her approach, his expression softening momentarily before returning to its focused intensity. "They'll be here before nightfall," he said without preamble. "Carson's not stupid enough to attack in the dark when we have the advantage of knowing the terrain." Haven nodded, her outward calm belying the rapid beating of her heart. "Everything's ready inside. Martha has everyone organized better than a military campaign." Morgan managed a tense smile. "That woman's a force of nature." He clapped Xavier on the shoulder. "I'll check the north position." As Morgan departed with the others, Haven and Xavier were left alone for the first time since his confession. The air between them felt charged with both the imminent danger and unspoken emotions. "Stay in the house," Xavier said, his voice gruff with concern. "No matter what happens out here." Haven stepped closer, determination in her eyes. "I'll do what needs to be done, just like everyone else." "Haven," Xavier began, frustration evident in his tone. "I'm not fragile, Xavier," she interrupted gently. "You know that better than anyone." He exhaled slowly, conflict clear on his face. "It's not about fragility, it's about—" He hesitated, searching for words. "It's about not being able to bear the thought of anything happening to you, not now. Not when I've just found you." The raw honesty in his voice stripped away Haven's carefully maintained composure. Without concern for propriety or who might see, she closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek. "Then understand that I feel the same way," she whispered. "I can't hide in safety while you're in danger. That's not who I am, and I think it's part of why you—" She paused, gathering her courage. "It's part of why you care for me." Xavier covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss against her palm. The tender gesture, so unexpected from this stoic man, brought tears to Haven's eyes. "When this is over," he said softly, "we'll have that conversation we started the other night, properly, without interruption." Haven nodded, smiling despite the circumstances. "I'll hold you to that promise, Mr. Stillman." The sound of hooves and a shout from outside broke the moment. Xavier squeezed her hand once more before releasing it, his expression shifting back to the focused intensity of a man preparing for battle. "That's our signal." "They've been spotted crossing the South Ridge." He checked his revolver one final time before holstering it. "Remember your training. Stay low, use cover, and don't take unnecessary risks." "The same goes for you," Haven replied, straightening her shoulders. "I expect you to keep your promise about that conversation." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Yes, madam." They exited the barn together, parting ways as Haven headed toward the main house, and Xavier joined Morgan at the defensive position behind the stone wall bordering the main yard. Scout followed Haven partway before Xavier whistled him back, the dog torn between his 2 favorite people before reluctantly returning to his master's side. From the upper window of the main house, Haven had a clear view of the ranch's southern approach. The dust cloud was visible now without a spyglass, and occasional flashes of movement could be seen as riders approached through the scattered trees and brush. Martha joined her at the window, a loaded shotgun in her capable hands. "They're not hiding their approach," she observed grimly. "That's never a good sign." Haven nodded in agreement, counting at least 15 riders in the advance group, with more dust suggesting others behind them. Their own forces numbered 22 men, including Xavier and Morgan, plus the women who could shoot if necessary. "They think their numbers give them confidence," Haven replied, checking her revolver for what felt like the 100th time. "Uncle Morgan said overconfidence is often the downfall of men like Carson." Martha made a non-committal sound. "Let's hope he's right." The riders drew closer, eventually halting just beyond rifle range. One man rode forward, slightly a tall figure on a black horse who Haven assumed must be Carson himself. Through Morgan's spyglass, she could make out his features, cold eyes set in a weather-beaten face, a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, and the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence. Below in the yard, Morgan stepped forward to meet the challenge, Xavier flanking him slightly, his stance casual but alert. Haven's heart clenched at the sight of them standing exposed, though she knew the ranch hands had rifles trained on Carson from multiple hidden positions. The conversation was too distant to hear clearly, but the body language told the story. Carson gesturing expansively at the ranch, Morgan shaking his head firmly, tension building with each exchange. After several minutes, Carson spat on the ground contemptuously before wheeling his horse around and rejoining his men. Morgan and Xavier returned to their positions behind the stone wall, and an uneasy silence fell over the ranch. Minutes stretched into an hour as the standoff continued, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. "What are they waiting for?" Martha murmured, the tension evident in her voice. Haven was about to respond when a flicker of movement caught her eye, not from the main group of riders, but from the wooded area to the east of the house. She focused the spyglass, heart racing when she confirmed what she'd seen. "They're trying to flank us," she said urgently. "There are men moving through the east woods." Martha immediately dispatched one of the younger boys to carry the warning to Morgan, while Haven continued to track the approaching threat. She counted 6 men advancing under cover of the trees, clearly intending to breach the ranch's defenses from an unexpected direction. The boy returned moments later, breathless with his report. "Mr. Keller says to be ready. Mr. Stillman's taking some men to intercept them." Haven watched anxiously as Xavier and 4 ranch hands slipped away from the main defense line, working their way toward the eastern approach. The main group of outlaws remained stationary, apparently waiting for their flanking party to get into position before launching their assault. What followed was a confusing blur of action. Gunshots erupted from the eastern woods, followed almost immediately by a charge from Carson's main force. The ranch yard became a chaos of shouting, gunfire, and billowing dust as defenders and attackers engaged. Haven abandoned her observation post, racing downstairs to help Martha coordinate the house's defense. Women loaded rifles and passed them to the men positioned at windows, while Martha directed the youngest children to shelter in the center hallway, away from potential gunfire. Through the windows, Haven caught glimpses of the battle raging outside, Morgan directing the defense from behind the stone wall. Ranch hands firing measured shots rather than wasting ammunition, the attackers gradually being forced to seek cover as their initial charge faltered against the disciplined resistance. What she couldn't see was Xavier and his small group who had gone to counter the flanking maneuver. The continued gunfire from that direction suggested the fight was ongoing, but the smoke and confusion made it impossible to determine how it was progressing. A thunderous crash against the front door startled everyone inside. Someone was attempting to break in. Martha reacted instantly, positioning herself and 2 of the stronger women with loaded shotguns aimed at the entrance. "Next one who touches that door gets a chest full of buckshot," she called out, her voice remarkably steady. The pounding ceased, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. A cheer went up from the yard, suggesting the attackers were being repelled on multiple fronts. The battle continued for what felt like hours but was likely less than 40 minutes. Gradually, the gunfire became more sporadic, and through the window, Haven could see Carson's men retreating toward the tree line, carrying their wounded. Morgan appeared at the front door, his shirt sleeve bloodied but his expression triumphant. They're falling back. Jim's men are driving them off the south pasture now. The women inside cheered, though Haven's relief was tempered by immediate concern. Xavier, the Eastern group, Morgan's expression sobered slightly, still engaging the last of them. They tried to circle behind and fire the barn, but Xavier anticipated their move. He touched his wounded arm gingerly. I'm heading back out. Stay inside until we give the all clear. Haven nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to find Xavier to ensure he was unharmed. She forced herself to focus on helping Martha tend to a ranch hand who'd been brought in with a bullet grazed to his thigh, channeling her anxiety into practical action. The sounds of conflict gradually diminished until an eerie silence fell over the ranch. Haven found herself counting the minutes, straining to hear any indication of what was happening outside. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, Morgan's voice called from the yard, "All clear, they're gone." Martha threw open the door, and everyone poured outside to assess the damage and celebrate their successful defense. The ranch had suffered several outbuildings showed bullet damage, 2 horses had been wounded, and the south fence had been partially destroyed, but overall, they had prevailed with minimal losses. Haven scanned the gathering crowd anxiously, looking for Xavier's tall figure among the celebrating ranch hands. When she didn't see him, she approached her uncle, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Where's Xavier?" Morgan's face grew serious. "Eastern perimeter, last I saw." He was pursuing the last of their flanking party who tried to circle around behind us. Haven didn't wait to hear more, striding purposefully toward the eastern edge of the property, her heart pounding with fear she refused to acknowledge. Scout appeared from between 2 buildings, barking anxiously and circling around her legs before racing ahead, clearly wanting her to follow. "Take me to him," she urged, quickening her pace to keep up with the dog. Scout led her past the barn and toward a small ravine that marked the eastern boundary of the main ranch compound. As they crested the ridge, Haven spotted 3 figures in the distance, 2 of the ranch hands supporting a third between them as they made their way slowly back toward the house. With Scout bounding ahead, Haven ran toward them, recognizing Xavier as the wounded man being assisted. His shirt was dark with blood on one side, his face pale beneath his tan, but he was conscious and moving under his own power, albeit with support. "Xavier." She called, relief and fear mingling in her voice as she reached them. He looked up, pain evident in his eyes but a ghost of a smile touching his lips when he saw her. "Told you to stay in the house," he said, his voice weaker than normal but retaining its dry humor. "When have I ever followed orders completely?" Haven replied, quickly assessing his injury, a bullet wound to his left side, bleeding steadily but not catastrophically. "Let's get him to the house. Martha has medical supplies ready." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the ranch tended to its wounded and secured its boundaries against any potential return of Carson's men. Xavier's injury, while serious, proved less life-threatening than it had initially appeared. The bullet had grazed his ribs rather than penetrating deeply, resulting in significant blood loss but no critical internal damage. Martha, who had substantial experience with bullet wounds from her years on the frontier, cleaned and bandaged him efficiently in Morgan's study, which had been converted to a temporary infirmary. Haven assisted, her hands steady despite her internal turmoil, passing instruments and supplies as needed while offering silent prayers of gratitude that his injuries weren't worse. "You'll live," Martha pronounced when she'd finished, her practical tone belying the concern in her eyes. "But you need rest and plenty of it. No riding off after outlaws for at least 2 weeks. Xavier, propped against pillows on the leather couch, managed a weak chuckle that immediately transformed into a grimace of pain. "Yes, madam, I mean it," Martha insisted, gathering her medical supplies. "Haven, I'm putting you in charge of making sure this stubborn man follows orders for once in his life." "I'll ensure he behaves," Haven promised, meeting Xavier's gaze with determination in her eyes. Martha nodded approvingly before departing to check on the other wounded, leaving them alone in the quiet study. Outside, The sounds of the ranch returning to normal operations filtered through the windows, men calling to each other as they repaired damaged structures, horses being led to fresh pasture, life continuing despite the violence that had interrupted it. Haven sat beside Xavier on the edge of the couch, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. His usual composure was stripped away by pain and exhaustion, leaving his emotions closer to the surface than she'd ever seen them. "You promised me a conversation," she reminded him softly. After it was over, Xavier captured her hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. "I did, though I pictured it under slightly more dignified circumstances." Haven smiled, blinking away unexpected tears. "I don't need dignity, I just need you alive." "I fully intend to stay that way," Xavier assured her, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Especially now that I have a compelling reason." Haven's heart quickened at his words and the intensity in his gaze. "Carson?" she asked, needing to address the practical concern before they could speak of personal matters. Xavier's expression hardened slightly. "Wounded but escaped with about half his men. They won't be back anytime soon, they lost too many today, but eventually." He sighed, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured side. "That's a problem for another day." Haven nodded, understanding that the threat hadn't been eliminated entirely, merely postponed. "And Harker," a grim satisfaction crossed Xavier's face, "won't be troubling anyone again." He was leading the eastern flanking party, made the mistake of trying to set fire to the barn. He didn't elaborate further, but Haven understood what had happened during the confrontation. "I was so afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I couldn't find you after the fighting stopped." Xavier's hand tightened around hers. "I'm not easy to kill, too stubborn according to most who know me." Haven laughed softly, the sound catching on a sob she couldn't quite suppress. "I'm counting on that stubbornness. I've grown quite attached to it." Xavier's eyes softened, the guard he usually maintained completely lowered in this moment of vulnerability. "Haven," he began, then hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm not a man who speaks easily about feelings. The war taught me to keep things locked away, and the years after only reinforced that lesson." "I understand," Haven said gently. "You don't have to, I do," he interrupted, his voice gaining strength, "because you deserve to hear it plainly. I love you, Haven Keller. Have since I watched you stand your ground against those wolves, though I didn't recognize it then for what it was." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I never expected to find someone who would make me want to build a future again instead of just surviving each day, but here you are." Haven felt tears spilling freely down her cheeks now, joy overwhelming her usual composure. "I love you too," she whispered, leaning forward to press her forehead gently against his. "My brave, stubborn, honorable cowboy who found me fighting wolves and somehow became everything I never knew I needed." Xavier released her hand to carefully cup her face, his calloused fingers infinitely gentle against her skin. "I don't have much to offer beyond myself," he said, echoing his words from nights earlier. "But everything I am is yours if you'll have me." Instead of answering with words, Haven closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that conveyed everything she couldn't articulate: her fear for him, her joy at his survival, her love that had grown so unexpectedly in the midst of danger and uncertainty. His beard was rough against her skin, but his lips were surprisingly soft as they moved against hers with equal passion and tenderness. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly and Xavier wincing slightly from the exertion, Haven couldn't help but smile at the wonder in his eyes. "I'll take that as a yes," he murmured, a rare full smile transforming his face despite his pain. "A definite yes," Haven confirmed, carefully settling beside him on the couch, mindful of his injury. "Though Martha will have both our hides if this activity sets back your recovery." Xavier chuckled, wrapping his uninjured arm around her shoulders to draw her closer. "Worth the risk," he declared, pressing a kiss to her temple. They remained that way, talking softly as the afternoon faded into evening, sharing stories and dreams they'd never voiced before. Outside, the ranch continued its rhythms of repair and renewal, resilient in the face of the day's violence. Inside the quiet study, two people who had found each other against impossible odds planned a future neither had dared hope for just months before. Morgan found them there at dusk, Haven asleep against Xavier's shoulder while he maintained a protective vigil despite his own exhaustion. The older man took in the scene with knowing eyes, nodding to himself as he quietly backed out of the room, leaving them to the peace they'd both earned. The weeks following the attack brought gradual healing to both the ranch and its inhabitants. Under Martha's strict supervision, Xavier recovered steadily from his wound, though his natural restlessness made him a challenging patient. Haven divided her time between her regular duties and ensuring Xavier followed medical orders, their growing relationship becoming an open secret that brought knowing smiles from Martha and good-natured teasing from the ranch hands. Word arrived that Carson and the remains of his gang had fled the territory, heading south toward the Mexican border after their decisive defeat at the Keller ranch. The surrounding communities celebrated the victory, and Morgan's reputation as a force to be reckoned with grew even stronger throughout the region. As summer began its gradual transition to fall, bringing cooler nights and golden light across the landscape, Xavier was finally declared fully healed by a satisfied Martha. He marked the occasion by asking Morgan for a private conversation, the contents of which Haven could guess, but pretended not to when Xavier asked her to accompany him on a ride the following morning. They set out at dawn, Xavier on Artemis and Haven on her own horse, a spirited mare named Juniper she'd trained herself over the summer months. Scout bounded ahead of them, delighted to have his two favorite humans together on an adventure. The morning air held the first hints of autumn crispness, and dew sparkled on the grass as they rode east toward a ridge Xavier particularly favored. They reached the summit as the sun fully cleared the horizon, bathing the landscape in golden light. Haven gasped at the view, rolling hills stretching toward distant mountains, the ranch buildings tiny in the valley below, wilderness and civilization coexisting in breathtaking harmony. "This is magnificent," she said, dismounting to better appreciate the panorama. "No wonder you brought me here." Xavier joined her, taking her hand naturally as they stood side by side. The past weeks had brought an easy intimacy between them, comfortable silences and casual touches that spoke of deepening connection. "I found this spot my first week in the territory," Xavier explained, his voice reflective. "Was still trying to outrun the war back then, looking for somewhere that felt clean, untouched by what I'd seen." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'd come here when things got too loud in my head. It always helped." Haven leaned against his shoulder, understanding what it cost this private man to share such personal struggles. "And now," Xavier turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it, the morning light illuminating his features and the love plainly visible in his eyes. "Now I have something better than a view to quiet the noise." He reached into his pocket, producing a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns. "I spoke with Morgan yesterday, asked for his blessing, though he told me rather pointedly that the only permission that mattered was yours." Haven's breath caught as Xavier dropped to one knee before her, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the morning light. "I carved the box myself," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she found endearing from this usually confident man. "The ring was my mother's. Been carrying it since I left Pennsylvania, though I never thought I'd have cause to use it." Haven felt tears welling in her eyes as Xavier took a deep breath and continued, "Haven Keller, I never believed in second chances until I found you fighting off wolves with more courage than sense." His smile was tender, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "You've brought light back into a life I thought would always remain in shadow. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Haven barely let him finish before dropping to her knees before him, taking his face between her hands. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "1,000 times yes, Xavier Stillman." The kiss they shared sealed their promise, sweet and passionate against the backdrop of the landscape that had brought them together. Scouts circled them excitedly, seemingly understanding the significance of the moment, while their horses grazed contentedly nearby, unimpressed by human sentimentality. When they finally broke apart, Xavier slipped the ring onto Haven's finger with hands that trembled slightly despite their usual steadiness. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her all along. "It's beautiful," Haven said, admiring how the simple elegance suited her lifestyle far better than the ostentatious jewelry that had been fashionable in St. Louis. "My father was a carpenter," Xavier explained, his thumb caressing the band on her finger, "made simple things to last. Always thought that was a good approach to life." His eyes met hers, vulnerable and hopeful, and to love. Haven's heart overflowed with emotion at his words. "I think your father was a very wise man," she said softly, "and his son learned the lesson well." They spent the morning on the ridge, planning their future together as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Xavier spoke of a piece of land he'd been saving for a perfect spot about 5 miles from Morgan's ranch, with good water access and fertile soil for crops alongside grazing land. "It's not as grand as your uncle's spread," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But there's room to build something solid, something that could grow over time." Haven silenced his concerns with a kiss. "It sounds perfect, a place that's truly ours." Their wedding took place 6 weeks later as the aspens turned golden in the higher elevations and the ranch prepared for winter. The ceremony was held in the Keller ranch yard, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons under Martha's expert direction. The entire community turned out to celebrate neighboring ranchers, townspeople from Eager and Springerville, even Sheriff Taylor and his deputies who had worked with Xavier over the years. Haven wore a dress of ivory silk that Martha and several ranch wives had secretly sewn for her, incorporating lace from her mother's wedding gown that she'd brought from St. Louis. Xavier, almost unrecognizable in a new black suit and with his beard neatly trimmed, waited for her beside the improvised altar with Morgan at his side, his expression transforming from nervous to awestruck as Haven approached on her uncle's arm. The local minister officiated, but it was the personal vows exchanged between Haven and Xavier that moved many in the audience to tears, promises of partnership, protection, and unwavering love spoken in voices steady with conviction despite the emotion behind them. "I found you fighting battles alone," Xavier said, holding Haven's hands in his as he recited the vows he'd written himself. "I promise you'll never face another one without me by your side, for all the days we're granted together." Haven's response was equally heartfelt. "You showed me what true strength looks like, not in conquering others, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to build instead of destroy. I promise to be your partner in all things, your shelter in storms both within and without, your constant companion on whatever path we travel together." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from the gathered community. Scout barked enthusiastically, racing circles around the newlyweds as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed a small army thanks to Martha's planning. Xavier surprised everyone, including his bride, by taking up the fiddle for several tunes, playing with a joy and abandon few had ever witnessed from the usually reserved man. As midnight approached, the couple slipped away from the festivities to begin their new life together. Riding toward the cabin, Xavier had been preparing for the past 6 weeks with help from the ranch hands. Scout bounded ahead along the moonlit trail, occasionally circling back as if to ensure they were following. The cabin that welcomed them was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney, sturdy porch, and windows that caught the morning light. Inside, Xavier had created a comfortable home with furniture he'd either made himself or traded for with neighboring craftsmen. A fire had been laid ready in the hearth, and fresh flowers brightened the simple table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stillman," Xavier said softly as he carried Haven across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. Haven looked around at the cabin, evidence of Xavier's careful planning and hard work visible in every detail, and felt a sense of rightness that surpassed anything she'd experienced in the grand houses of St. Louis. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning to face her husband with eyes shining in the lamplight. "Everything I could have wished for." Xavier's kiss was tender, a promise of the future they would build together. "Just the beginning," he murmured against her lips. "We have a lifetime ahead of us." Outside, the Arizona night wrapped around their small cabin, stars blazing in the clear autumn sky. Inside, two people who had found each other against impossible odds began the first chapter of a shared life. Their separate journeys now merged into a single path forward, one they would walk together through whatever challenges and joys awaited. Spring came early to the high country the following year, bringing green grass and wildflowers in abundance across the Stillman homestead. The winter had been productive despite the snow and cold. Xavier had added 2 rooms to the cabin and acquired a small herd of cattle to complement their growing operation. Haven had established a thriving vegetable garden and begun keeping chickens, her city-bred hands now as capable in rural tasks as they once had been with embroidery and piano keys. Scout had acquired a companion, a female border collie mix named Willow, who had shown up at their door during a February blizzard and never left. The 2 dogs worked together to keep predators away from the livestock and provided constant entertainment with their antics around the property. On a perfect May morning, as dawn broke over the eastern ridge, Haven stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, a hand resting unconsciously on her swelling belly as she watched Xavier work with a young horse in the corral. His patience with the spirited colt reminded her of how he'd been with her in those early days, steady, respectful of her independence, but providing guidance when needed. Their first child was due in late summer, and the approaching parenthood had brought a new dimension to their already strong partnership. Xavier had thrown himself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness, building a cradle from ponderosa pine and expanding their cabin to include a nursery with windows positioned to catch the morning sun. His protective instincts had intensified with Haven's pregnancy, sometimes to the point of hovering that made her laugh and occasionally bristle with frustration. Yet beneath his concern was such profound joy and wonder that she couldn't remain exasperated for long. As if sensing her thoughts, Xavier looked up from his work with the colt, his face breaking into the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He secured the horse before making his way to the porch, his stride purposeful as always. "You should be resting," he said, though the twinkle in his eyes acknowledged that such suggestions rarely influenced his independent wife. Haven laughed, leaning into his embrace as he joined her. "The baby and I are enjoying the morning air. Besides, someone has to supervise your horse training techniques." Xavier's hand came to rest protectively over hers on her belly, his expression softening as he felt the strong kick of their child. "Active this morning," he observed, wonder evident in his voice. "Always," Haven replied with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "Martha says that means a strong-willed child." Xavier chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "With us as parents, I'd expect nothing less." They stood together watching the sunrise fully illuminate their land, the growing garden, the grazing cattle, the foundation being laid for a barn that would eventually replace the temporary structure they'd been using. In just a year, they had transformed raw wilderness into a promising homestead, working side by side through storms and clear skies alike. "I received a letter from Sheriff Taylor yesterday," Xavier mentioned after a comfortable silence. "Carson's been captured in New Mexico territory, facing trial for his crimes there and here." Haven nodded, relief washing through her at the news. Though the outlaw leader had not returned to their region after his defeat at the Keller ranch, his freedom had remained a distant concern in the back of their minds. "That's good news," she said simply. Xavier's arm tightened around her shoulders. It closes a chapter, lets us focus completely on the future. His hand caressed her belly again, on this little one and whatever brothers or sisters might follow. Haven smiled at his words, her own thoughts already imagining their family growing alongside their homestead. Morgan and Martha are riding over for dinner, she reminded him, and the Andrews from the next valley. Xavier nodded, reluctantly releasing her. I'll finish with the colt and clean up before they arrive. He hesitated, his expression growing more serious. Your uncle mentioned something about considering retirement in his last visit. Talked about perhaps us taking over management of the main ranch eventually, if we were interested. Haven's eyebrows rose in surprise. He didn't mention that to me. I think he wanted me to discuss it with you first, Xavier explained. See if it's something we might want before he makes any formal arrangements. Haven considered the possibility, gazing out at the homestead they'd built with their own hands. What do you think? Would you want that responsibility? Xavier was quiet for a moment, his eyes thoughtful as he surveyed their land. Part of me says yes, it's a magnificent operation, and Morgan has built something worth preserving. He turned to meet her gaze directly. But there's something special about building our own place from nothing, something that belongs completely to us, shaped by our own vision. Haven nodded, understanding perfectly. I feel the same way. I love Uncle Morgan, but this, she gestured to their surroundings, this is ours in a way the Keller ranch could never be. Xavier's smile returned, relief evident in his features. We'll talk to him together then. Perhaps there's a middle path, we stay independent but help with management as he gradually steps back. Haven reached up to touch his bearded cheek, still marveling sometimes that this thoughtful, complex man was hers. Together, she agreed, the word encompassing far more than just the conversation with her uncle. Their first child, a son they named Samuel Morgan Stillman, arrived in August during a spectacular thunderstorm that seemed fitting for the dramatic entrance of their firstborn. With Martha's experienced assistance, Haven delivered a healthy, robust boy with Xavier's blue eyes and her auburn hair, his lusty cries announcing his arrival to the world with unmistakable determination. Xavier, who had paced anxiously throughout the lengthy labor, was transformed by the sight of his son cradled in Haven's arms. The hardened frontiersman who had tracked outlaws and faced down wolf packs without flinching wept openly as he held his child for the first time, whispering promises of protection and guidance against the infant's downy head. Life settled into new rhythms with Samuel's arrival, days and nights organized around his needs while the work of the homestead continued. Haven discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, managing both motherhood and her contributions to their growing ranch with Xavier's steady support and partnership. Their small family received frequent visitors, Morgan and Martha most often, but also neighboring ranchers, friends from Eager and Springerville, and occasionally Xavier's former colleagues from his tracking days who marveled at the domestic transformation of the man they'd known as a solitary figure. As autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, Haven sat on their porch rocker nursing Samuel while watching Xavier mend a section of fencing. Scout and Willow supervised from nearby, occasionally chasing imaginary threats before returning to their self-appointed guard duties. Looking at her husband, his movements economical and precise, his occasional glances toward her and Samuel filled with quiet joy, Haven reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from St. Louis society to this remote Arizona homestead. The wolves that had threatened her life had inadvertently led her to a happiness deeper and more authentic than anything she could have imagined in her previous existence. As if sensing her thoughts, Xavier looked up, meeting her gaze across the yard. The connection between them required no words, a shared understanding built through danger and joy, hardship and triumph. The forging of a bond stronger than either had believed possible when fate first brought them together on that twilight evening nearly 2 years before. Samuel stirred against her breast, his tiny hand clutching at her dress as he nursed. Haven stroked his downy head, overwhelmed by the love that filled her heart for both her son and the remarkable man who had given her this new life. "Papa will teach you to ride when you're bigger," she whispered to her son, "and to track and to play the fiddle on quiet evenings. But most importantly, he'll show you what true courage looks like, not in fighting, though he can do that when necessary, but in loving completely, in building something meaningful from nothing, in finding joy even after sorrow." Xavier approached, having completed his task, and settled beside them on the porch. His gentle hand caressed Samuel's head before coming to rest on Haven's shoulder, his touch conveying all the love words often failed to express adequately. "What are you two conspiring about?" he asked, his voice tender. Haven leaned into his embrace, their son cradled between them. "Just counting our blessings," she replied softly, "and they are many indeed." Xavier's smile, once so rare but now a frequent sight, warmed his entire face. "More than I ever dared hope for," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And growing every day." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, bathing their homestead in golden light, Haven thought of the wolves that had once threatened her life. In facing that danger, she had found not just a protector but a partner, not just safety but love, not just survival but a life more rich and fulfilling than she could have imagined. The cowboy who had found her fighting wolves alone had indeed joined her battle. And then her life, transforming both their separate journeys into a shared adventure that promised to unfold with new chapters of joy and challenge in the years to come. Their story, like the Arizona territory itself, was still being written, day by day and season by season, with courage, perseverance, and abiding love.